One of the things that I thought was interesting was that as a modern reader, the kind of initial reaction to reading this is it's like, oh, he's talking about atoms. That there's, in my mind anyway, it's easy to make that initial connection and say, oh, he must be talking about atoms. But as I read through the first section, it seemed to me that I had to piece together a few different things to kind of say, this is what seems to be the kind of motivation for this text, because coming to it, as Wes said, there's obviously a lot of background behind this. And when he starts talking about the Cartesians, you can see that he's clearly responding to a lot of different things. But the point is, things, what he calls, I think, compounds, right, can be broken into other things. But at first I thought he was saying that it's not ad infinitum. And then I think realized later that he actually says it is. But the key piece is that there is no empty space. So if you keep breaking things down, like points in a line or objects, and there's no empty space, at some point you have to get to some kind of last thing, and every bit of space, everything is filled up. And that there's a huge problem with this idea that the last thing could be something that you in turn would then have to break apart into something else. So how do you get to a last thing that isn't divisible? And that's
Right.
essentially what a monad is, right? It's a concept that describes something that is indivisible.
The other problem is once you get to this indivisible thing, which doesn't have any, that's simple, you have to describe how that's going to give us this macroscopic experience of changing and varied reality. And the way he does that is to say that despite its simplicity, these monads have a variety of affections or qualities in the form of perceptions. So a monad, instead of having all these fundamental, let's say, properties of physics, get these properties that are subjective in nature, these perceptions.
Yeah, well, I found that really weird when he introduced the word perceptions initially, because he's saying, how are these monads going to change? Well, he wants them to all be independent in some strong way, which means that they are only changed by themselves. They don't push each other around. And this would seem to be the most bizarre part of the whole thing. When you're trying to explain why things seem to interact, and he is in favor, of the natural sciences and talking about causality and things pushing each other around in the rough sense, in the practical sense. But he thinks, strictly speaking, none of these monads influences each other. We're all just influenced directly by God. Well, through a self-propelling force within each of the monads. And that was what was bizarre. So he says each of these monads still changes constantly. And that's very hard to explain, how a simple indivisible substance could have changes at all, because usually when something changes, that means because part of it drops off or part of it is altered in some way that it looks different to us, or it's rearranged. I mean, just if you talk about the destruction of physical objects or making a pot out of something, out of a piece of clay or whatever, those are obvious changes. But if a simple thing has to change, he says, well, they just have multiple properties, and some of the properties themselves change, and this all has to be motivated by this internal force. And he calls that perception. So he says, the passing state, which involves and represents a multitude in unity, or in the simple substance, is nothing else than what is called perception. So I thought that was bizarre, because perception we normally think of as I see an object in front of me, and so some of the people he was reacting to, in fact, had these physical theories about parts of the object that I'm looking at are jumping up and hitting me in the eyes. And of course we have now the idea that light is bouncing off them, and so we're physically interacting with the thing in some ways. But he's saying what a perception is, and I just thought he was using the word in a completely bizarre, new technical way, which he sort of is, because he can't have a view of perception like that, because he says all these monads are just self-propelling. So when we perceive something, it's not that we're interacting with that thing and somehow being aware of it. It's that something within ourselves causes us to have this sense of this thing in front of us. And he wants to call it perception, right? He wants to use this term even for objects much, much smaller, much, much simpler than we are. So any monad, including these tiniest ones, regulating the smallest of structures, the smallest of organic structures, have this self-propelling force. And he says that when anything seems to affect them, he just wants to call that perception. So let's just call the changes that occur in this perceptions, and they're caused by appetite or appetition, word that he uses. Freaking bizarre.
My understanding of that little passage there was monads could not be influenced from the outside, so they don't function like bodies, like mechanical causation, right? They can't be warmed or cooled or split up or what have you. And so he talks about the soul, and he's trying to say that perceptions, I thought at one point the way I understood it was he was saying that a monad is like the soul, or it's like consciousness without memory.
Well, and I'm trying to, in some ways, get at what's motivating him to use the word monad for all these different things. To me, he comes up with this idea of the monad as the smallest possible thing, because the smallest possible thing can't be material, like we were saying. And if it's going to be then immaterial, well, wouldn't it and all the other things we think of as immaterial substances, like God, like our souls, our spirits, or the organizing force behind the growth of animals, so, right, what Aristotle was calling forms or teleology, those must all be reflections of the same kind of thing. So all those he calls monads. And he sketches it out enough that he kind of gives us a picture of how all these can be related. I don't know that he has a wonderful reason for insisting that these are all different versions of the same kind of thing, other than that's the simplest explanation, and God likes to do things in a simple way.
Well, I think the motivation it begins as a mechanistic explanation, right? We want to get to a unified principle, not a bunch of unharmonious principles. So that's why, for instance, physicists are looking to unify quantum mechanics and physics.
Sure. Yep. All science uses as few laws as possible.
Yeah, you want to get to a fundamental principle. In this case, it is in part that, but he's thinking of what's explanatorily most simple. But I think the physics is a useful analogy in this case. As a physicist, he expects that what he's delving down to is these very similar atoms. But this whole paradox that he's getting at, I think physics still faces it. To explain things, you have to be able to cut them into pieces, in a sense, in order to talk about their causes. At some point, that chain of explanation must stop. And then you get something which is essentially irrational. The rational must be built up out of all these irrational elements. And I say irrational because once you get to the ultimate particle, let's say in physics, so the motivation for all of this is to look for a way that we can get at the paradox of these simple irrational things building up the world without talking about their physical extension, shape, and divisibility, which it can have because it has no parts. So the way to sneak around that is to
say they have
go
souls.
to subjective, yeah. And I think it's brilliant. It's to go to this idea that the principle involved, in fact, has something to do with the subjective perceptions of all these monads, which are then coordinated. And so let's go into the different types of monads as well, because everything has a monad, or is composed of an infinite number of monads. He distinguishes early on between what he simply calls entelechies, which he calls them to get at he calls them that something like perfections or perfection seeking. He uses that to talk about their self-sufficiency and the sense in which they're like automata. And then for animals, there are monads that he calls souls, and these animals have distinct perceptions plus memory. So for the entelechies, there's this what he calls unconscious perception. And by the way, this is another famous thing with Leibniz. He's the first to talk explicitly about the unconscious. So all monads have this very fuzzy, kind of vague, unconscious perception going on.
He uses the word perception, but I think you could think of it as just being apparently affected by things.
No, I think it really is perception.
See, I guess one of the examples I heard of this is, you can talk about a thermometer when it reacts to a changing temperature by, the mercury goes up. It's like saying that is a perception by the thermometer of heat. That's kind of what the basic monads have, that they're affected by things in this way, but they're not aware of it. They can't sort of decide to react or not to react, or they just have it's a very mechanical reaction, even though we've already said that since they're monads, they're not actually mechanically attached to these things. They're self-motivating.
They're not aware in the sense of having self-consciousness, which is what only, or even the distinct perceptions of animals. They don't have the self-consciousness or what he calls apperception, but they do share something with us as human beings, which is that even the most basic monad has unconscious perception, which is something that we can sort of catch in ourselves. We know that when we go to sleep, for instance, there are things that we've experienced that we've entirely forgotten, or we know he uses that analogy of being hit on the head and having a very fuzzy perception. I do think he actually thinks of it as perception, even if it's this extremely low-level unconscious perception.
That's what I was trying to get at earlier. I remember at one point he talks about perceptions, and he distinguishes, he says, from apperceptions or consciousness. And he's trying to use that falling asleep. There's at one point where he says something very strange about distinguish long periods of unconsciousness from death, which is kind of an interesting little sentence there. But we have to, I guess, sort of either very, very narrowly construe what he means when he says perceptions. It's a very technical term for him. Or we have to sort of more broadly construe it to mean the types of things that go through a mind or a consciousness of sorts that aren't related to perceptions of the outside world, which would be an apperception, and don't tie to memory to create something like consciousness. So if you imagine Descartes' thinking thing, but without memory through time and without recourse to any external phenomena to create concepts, whatever passed through that thinking thing is kind of what would be the perception. Now, how much content they would have, I don't know. And as we'll see, he's going to bring in God later on to kind of fix that for us, to solve that problem for us. But
think of it in terms of a gradation. Think of a gradation between the highest consciousness and then the lowest form. But there's no such thing as a complete absence of perception.
Actually, he uses the term apperception, what he talks about as self-reflective perception. It's not, apperception is not reflection, is not perception of the external world.
Okay.
All of these are, of course, I'm going to stop making this qualification, but none of them are, strictly speaking, perceiving the external world, because we all only perceive what's already in us and all that kind of stuff, because these monads can never be affected by each other. I'm going to stop saying that, just assume that that's the case. But with that caveat in mind, all of these types of perception are perceptions of things nearby us, of the external world. It could be in our heads or not in our, they're of something that is not apparently the monad itself. I mean, if we're going to talk about unconscious perceptions in a way that we as readers understand, we have to think about something with a mind that is at least a little bit like ours. Right. So I might see something, but I don't really notice it. But then you ask me like, oh, did you see that thing? Oh, okay. I guess I did. So I had an unconscious perception of it. Or you could use hypnosis to pull it out of me. Or maybe there are things likewise that an animal notices, but doesn't act upon or does not bring to the fore of their consciousness. So those are unconscious perceptions. If you're going to say that the smallest, tiniest piece of water, which is a monad, has a perception, you have to be using it in a weird technical way. You have to be saying that it is what we would say in everyday language. It's being pushed around. It's being causally affected by something else. And the way it's reacting, well, he wants to call that a perception.
But it is of the same kind. As radical as it sounds, he means that. And take, for instance, his explanation of death. The monad that is your rational soul could become the monad that is the piece of water.
Yes.
And the only change is its hierarchical relationship to other monads.
That should be pointed out, that all these monads cannot be created or destroyed because they don't have points. They don't have pieces.
They don't have parts.
Right, they don't have parts. That's the way something can be created or destroyed is if you build it. But since these monads are just indivisibly simple, they must have all existed out of God's will from the beginning of time, and they will continue to exist forever, which doesn't mean that all animals are immortal or something. So he has that weird explanation of how they can change their properties like you were just talking about.